Depending on where in the world you are, some of the footage that I'm about to show you in this video might shock you or even disturb you, but I just wanted to share some real-life footage of the situation in Sweden, in Stockholm in particular, right now. And for those of you who don't know, I live in Sweden. I have lived here for basically my entire life, except for 2-ish years when I lived in the US. And I do want to say that I'm not fully engaged in everything that's happening right now. I decided a while back not to dive too deep into the news because I think doing that comes with more negatives than positives. So I only keep myself informed on what I need to know in order to keep myself and those around me as safe as possible and not to add any stress to the healthcare. And also, since the situation is constantly changing and being monitored, everything that I'll be talking about is how the situation is today. Tomorrow might look different. So there has been no lockdown in Sweden. Most places have remained open, and there's been tons of footage showing the streets here in Stockholm where people are walking around in crowds, eating out, taking the train, hanging out with friends, and by the looks of it, kind of living on as usual. And ever since the very beginning of the pandemic, Sweden has been criticized by other countries for its approach of tackling the virus, which has looked very different from most other countries. And there has been headlines such as, is Sweden's controversial approach working, and is Sweden's lack of coronavirus lockdown a fatal mistake? And in the beginning, most of the criticism and headlines were negative, calling the approach lazy, but now I've seen that there's been a change for some who are starting to, see the possibility that maybe the approach is being effective. There's also been a lot of memes. But so yeah, what's going on really in Sweden? So there's definitely been more recommendations from the authorities as opposed to restrictions, although there has been some restrictions, such as you're not allowed to be in crowds of more than 50 people. But I guess the attitude has been more like, we recommend that you don't throw a dinner party with your friends, but we can't stop you would you choose to do that. So technically most people could live on more or less as usual. Would they choose to? With some restrictions, of course, but a lot of people, myself included, choose not to. And when I say that, I'm not taking into consideration those who have lost their jobs or worse, who of course cannot live on as usual, but I'm more referring to the possibility of going out and going places and so on, since a lot of places do remain open. Like technically I could still go to the gym, go to my favorite restaurants and hang out with friends, but even though a lot of these places are open, many of them do still have certain rules to ensure distance is being held. But I wouldn't be able to, for example, go to my local library since it's been closed now, and I also wouldn't be able to go to certain museums. Now, those are obviously not necessary places to go to, but I'm just trying to paint the picture for you. So, why is the situation in Sweden like this? Why are Swedes seemingly living on as usual instead of staying at home? Well, generally speaking, in Sweden, the people have quite a bit of trust in the authorities, and the authorities have quite a bit of trust in the people. As the state epidemiologist said, the Swedish strategy is mainly based on voluntary cooperation and individual responsibility. Also in Sweden, pandemic or not, people kind of naturally keep their distance from each other. More than half of all Swedish homes are made up of one resident, which is the highest proportion in Europe. So it's not like in many other countries where it's normal for a lot of people to live together and to have roommates and so on. We are a bit isolated by nature. So yeah, pandemic or not, people aren't really up in your space, so to speak. Now, what does it really look like when you go out for a stroll in the midst of a pandemic here in Stockholm? So I do go out on walks every day, and so does a lot of other people. And if you're going to go out, especially if you live in the city, fully avoiding everyone is pretty much impossible. Unless you take a drive out to the forest somewhere, which I actually did a few weeks ago, and actually even then, we still were not completely alone. So yeah, there's people everywhere. And in my experience, at least so far, I'd say most people are being respectful and do keep their distance, but some people do not. So being alert is definitely a must unless you want to be walking side by side with strangers, because you definitely can't count on everyone cooperating and distancing themselves, even though a lot of people do. As for my thoughts on how Sweden is handling this, like I said, I'm not keeping up with everything and I'm definitely no expert, but I'm shocked at how so many people choose to live on as usual, hanging out with their friends, going out to the club, and so on, and how people use the argument, life must go on, with no consideration to the elderly, the vulnerable, and the healthcare. And I think that regardless of formal restrictions or not, the least we can do is sacrifice at least part of our everyday lives for the sake of those I just mentioned. It's definitely disturbing to see how on one hand, healthcare workers are working so hard and making so many sacrifices, and then on the other hand, some people can't even sacrifice seeing their friends for beers. Now I'd love to know your thoughts on the situation. I know that whenever I post being outdoors on my Instagram, I always get messages from people who have been home for weeks and who aren't allowed to go out. So please share what your situation looks like. Thank you for watching and keep safe, and I'll see you soon.